Good morning, everyone. My name is Kimberly McQuarrie, and I'm the Director of Community Programming and the Co-Director of the Innovation Labs here at the Dalí Museum. We're so pleased that you could join us for this edition of our Coffee with a Curator series. And today we are joined by my incomparable colleague, Peter Tush, the Senior Curator of Education, who's going to make sure we kick off a Florida summer in appropriate fashion by presenting a talk on Dalí and the beach. For those of us who are not snowbirds and have been here, we'll all know that actually summer started in March. So we're a little behind, but you know, all to the good. June's a nice marker for summer. Now, before we get to the talk, as usual, we'd really like to thank those who make events like this possible for us. And that includes the city of St. Petersburg for their continued sponsorship of our museum and programs. And of course, a special thank you to all of our members who make events like this possible for everyone. Now, you can visit our website, as usual, thedalí.org, for more information about programs like this, other lectures, and other exciting activities that we have going on, including these upcoming events for June. Next week, we have a lecture reflecting on the 20-year anniversary of St. Pete Pride. And then a very special opportunity. I know many of you realize that we're about to kick off a new exhibit towards the end of June. It's called The Visit by contemporary Uruguayan artist Yamandu Canosa. What you might not know is that on June 10th at 11 a.m. and at 3 p.m., you're going to have the very unique opportunity of being able to disturb the artist while he works. As he's installing the exhibition, you're going to have two opportunities to go in, watch him work, and be able to ask him questions about what he's doing and why things are being put in the places that they're being put, because everything is being done with an intention. So I encourage you to take advantage of that unique and limited opportunity. So register as soon as you can. And then on the 14th, we'll have Peter back to give a talk on surrealism and sexuality. And on Thursday, we are going to kick off our 3-month summer special event, Surreal Summer Nights. And first night, we're gonna have DJ Fresh spinning some tunes for us. And then in July and August, we'll be inviting some different DJs and different styles of music to the mix. So be sure to check those out. If jamming to the beat is not your speed, if you'd prefer something a little more zen, then you can join us for yoga at the Dalí on the 19th. And then on the 20th, a Monday, we're going to have a panel discussion, including Yamandu Canosa, the artist who is installing The Visit. He and William, our head curator, are going to be having an interesting conversation about The Visit and the contemporary art surrealist dialogue that is represented by the exhibit. And then finally, rounding out the month, you can join me for our video podcast, Follow the Tangent, which is also going to be focusing on the Canosa exhibit. So we'll have a lot of interesting things supporting our new exhibit that's going to be opening. Now, of course, for all of our events, we invite you to follow us on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And remember, you can always get our attention by posting with the hashtag the Dalí. Now, today it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Peter. And I was joking earlier that I should start this out, and I am going to actually start it out. What can I say about Peter? It's more, what can't I say about Peter? Peter is really the engine and the heart of everything that we do in the education department. And he has, of course, been that engine for several decades. His work touches almost every area of this museum, as he is the key interpreter of the collection and special exhibitions. He trains our docents, some of you know because you are said docents, scripts our audio guides, directs our school programming, and works with the curatorial team to develop special exhibits. Over the years, of course, he has become a fixture of this Coffee with a Curator series, and he's presented myriad talks on a wider range of subjects, from ghosts to women in surrealism, to surrealism and sexuality, as he's going to give us, and then, of course, today's talk on the beach. Now, today in his talk, he's going to turn to one of those spaces that held an eternal fascination for Dalí, and that is the beach. It appears in so many of his works, both realistically and in dreamlike fashion. And Peter's going to help us understand the special place that the beach holds in the Dalían body of work. So please join me in welcoming Peter.
Good morning, everybody. Hello, hello. Thank you all for joining us today. There are a lot of talks that I've given over the years. I've done talks, as Kim alluded to, everything from the Marx Brothers to Freud to sexuality. I've never given a talk on the beach. And so this is a bit different for me. It's not a topic I would have normally chosen, but it actually is perfect because we've just finished our Picasso show, which was really about an artist who desired to go on holiday to the sunny, warm Mediterranean. And we're about to open an exhibition of Yamandu Canosa, who also traveled to Dalí's Port Legat and really took in the environment and some of the key symbols related to Dalí's world of being right there on the Mediterranean. So what we're going to do today is just really look at Dalí and what place the beach holds for him. The Mediterranean waters, the rocks, the sand, the sun, and surf, which connects with our own city here in St. Petersburg and our lovely beaches all around us. This is a painting when Dalí was 17 years old. It's in the Foundation's collection, and I think it captures exactly the same sense of the beach and the Mediterranean and the water that we have here in St. Petersburg. You know, there is no doubt that Dalí thoroughly loved and enjoyed the beach as a young man, and that continued throughout his life. There are some photos throughout where I've been able to capture the way the beach and the water held such a magical importance to him. And he really is a product of this Mediterranean delirium, the way he would describe his world, particularly the jagged Costa Brava, the rocks of the Costa Brava, and the dreamlike beaches that surrounded him. This is a photograph by Clyde Butcher, and we did an extraordinary exhibition, I believe it was in 2015, of photographs that Clyde had collected when he traveled to Dalí's Mediterranean world. And they constantly focus on the beach and the place that held for Dalí and the place it still holds for all of us as tourists and people who are just drawn to these destinations. So for Dalí, the beach became a central part of his world in the summer in Cadaqués, somewhere between 1909 and 1910. And the area that we're talking about is this eastern tip at the top of Spain, which is the Catalan region that became Dalí's world for almost his entire life. And this is the beautiful view that we have from today, looking at the city that he called his summer home. So the parents purchased a property in Cadaqués, somewhere between 1909 and 1910. And this is where they established their home. These are more recent photographs, but just to give you a sense of how breathtaking the space is. If you haven't traveled there, it is an ultimate tourist destination. Here's a photograph from close to where Dalí's house was originally, looking at the Church of Cadaqués, right there along that Mediterranean water, which was constantly used by sailors and fishermen, but also has become much more recreational over the years. And then here's a photograph looking back towards where Dalí's house would have been. It would have been just beyond this area right here along that walkway along the Mediterranean. This is a good photograph a little bit over in one of the other coves that gets a little more, rural. There's landscape rather than buildings, and Dalí often declared his Catalan homeland by far the most beautiful place in the world. And certainly this waterfront view was what that was all about. Here's a photograph of Dalí's family in 1910. Every summer they would go on holiday, they would leave Figueres behind, and this became Dalí's magical sort of open sesame to becoming an artist. Every summer from the age of 6 all the way through the end of his life. This was his retreat, his place to go. And As he got older, by the 1950s and 60s, Dalí created a pattern where he would go to New York in the fall, he would go to Paris in the spring, and he would always return back to the Catalan region in the summer. So he kept the same pattern that he had when he was younger. Here's a painting he did when he was 16 years old. It was done for an illustration of a book, but it certainly captures sort of the magic and the almost supernatural qualities that are associated with this Mediterranean cove here in Cadaqués, where the summer home was. And you can see that's Mount Pani at the top, which these four witches are dancing the typical Catalan dance of the sardanes. It's a ring dance or a circle dance as they float above the beautiful bay below. Here is a piece that Dalí did when he was 19 years old. So this is Port Alguer, that same area, looking on that same walkway along the bay from Dalí's home. And this is one of his most extraordinary paintings, which I believe is in the Reina Sofia in Madrid. And one more to match from that same period of time, 1923. This is Cadaqués in our own collection. And this is always a perfect painting to talk about on our tour because we expect to find Dalí as a kind of open sesame to symbolic images and nightmarish visions. And this captures a very different side of that same artist. Obviously, he's younger, but there's a kind of idyllic connection with the landscape that's so peaceful and almost a kind of utopian type of view that we don't always associate this with the artist, but certainly the landscape fulfilled this desire within him. Dalí says that he can say without fear of falling into the slightest exaggeration that I know by heart each contour of the rocks and the beaches of Cadaqués. It was not a casual place to just spend some time while waiting for school to start. It was a place that he adored, and he knew every crevice of this place. As he does go to school in Madrid and gets a little bit more mature and more sophisticated and moves in a different direction, one of his most ambitious paintings is this one from 1926 called the Neo-Cubist Academy. And he painted this work after having visited Pablo Picasso in 1926. So he met his hero, who was 23 years older than him. He had gone to Paris to visit him. And when he comes back to Spain, this is the piece that he does. It's about 6 to 7 feet tall, and it's certainly the most ambitious piece he had done as a student. It definitely uses Picasso's language, and you can see that it focuses on the idea of a sailor being confronted by lust and by virtue. The idea of dedicated research and chastity, or a kind of spontaneous love of the body. And it's clear sort of which way Dalí is leaning in this presentation. But it's completely situated there on the rocks of Cap de Creus and the Catalan coast. And it is certainly recognizing the sea as something symbolic. A little bit later, the next year, Dalí was developing in his relationship with Federico Garcia Lorca. It had become a very, very strong connection. And so Dalí suggested that the two of them go to Cadaqués to enjoy this, I guess it was the Easter holiday. And there are many, many photographs taken at this point. But the key thing to take away is that for Dalí, the sea was a place to entertain. It was a place to bring friends to. It was a place to enjoy and truly live your best self. So Federico Garcia Lorca was just completely captivated and charmed by the environment, and it's easy to understand why Dalí continued to remain in that place no matter what was happening in his career. Here's a great photograph that I had never seen before. My colleague Samaya had found it, but it's perfect. It's like this would be the perfect postcard. Come to Cadaqués. And you can see a very, very young Dalí. At this point, he's 23, 24 years old, but crustaceans were very popular with the artist. He loved the food from the sea, the fruit from the sea, as well as the sea itself. So once he leaves school, he starts to totally, deeply dive into the world of Sigmund Freud, and the beach becomes a very strong part of this new turn in his artwork. So there's two paintings that kind of capture this, the imagination that the artist is bringing to this work. One is Apparatus in Hand from 1927. Dalí had just been basically expelled from the school because he refused to finished the baccalaureate examination. He walked out on his professors, and he was searching for a way to go further exploring Sigmund Freud's writings. At the same time, he was very influenced by what was happening in Paris with the surrealists. He's still in Spain, but he's seeing their work in Barcelona. So this is one of his very first attempts to create something very different than what he had done up until this point. And it has to do with situating himself as a figure, desiring the women, the bathers of the beach, and at the same time having a fear and horror of that situation. And so it's called Apparatus in Hand. It has to do with Dalí's vice of masturbation, his guilt that he felt for it, but constantly the sources of desire that he was both compelled towards and at the same time repelled from. And he situates it on the beach, and it has to do with bathers. So he was constantly surrounded by both source of desire and a source of horror. This piece captures that even more thoroughly. This is definitely intended to place Dalí on the map as a very disturbing visionary, somebody to be repelled by. He wanted to create controversy and totally shock the public. And that's pretty much what this painting did. This is part of a body of work Dalí did in 1928 that he referred to as his anti-art paintings, definitely under the spell of Juan Miró, who's already a surrealist, but also a Catalan. But Dalí pushes it further. These are all explicitly about sexual horror, sexual disgust, sexual fears. And he's using Picasso's bathers from the early 1920s and transforming them into really hideous figures. But again, it has to do with the beach. And one thing you may be aware of or may not, but Dalí actually is compelled to take sand and gravel from the beach and glue it into his composition. So it is a tactile need to situate this on the beach outside of his house. So from this rather disturbing moment where Dalí is truly pushing a lot of buttons and trying to upset a lot of people, we move into the moment where he has a break with his family. And he has a falling out with his father shortly after he and his friend Luis Buñuel made the movie The Andalusian Dog. They go to Paris in 1929 in April. They make this movie. The movie becomes a sensation, and it definitely excites the surrealists. That summer, a group of surrealists come down to Cadaqués to visit Dalí for a summer holiday. Luis Buñuel is there. And during this time, Dalí meets his wife, the woman who will become his wife, Gala Eloir. All of this is disturbing to Dalí's father. He's horrified by her, he's horrified by the surrealists, and basically by the winter of that year, somewhere around Christmas time, Dalí and his father have this terrible fight. He's thrown out of the house. The very first thing he does is he goes to the beach of Cadaqués with his friend Luis Buñuel. He shaves his head, and he places a sea urchin on top of his head and makes sure that he gets a photograph of it. And what this means symbolically is that Dalí sees himself as a persecuted son, and he's using the idea of William Tell, the story of William Tell who shoots the apple off his son's head, but turns it into a story where the father wants to destroy the son. And Dalí's father's favorite food were sea urchins caught right there in the coast of the Mediterranean. So he's placing the sea urchin on his head to distract the father so hopefully he can escape. That's the kind of symbolic thinking that Dalí was doing at this point, and that's why there's a sea urchin on his head. And then later, he placed the image of Gala over the photograph and created a photo montage. So that was done at a later date, but it is very compelling. And also he has this nice, lovely sort of starfish right at his throat. Almost immediately, within a month of being thrown out of his family's house, he goes to the cove just 10 minutes away, which is Port Legat, and he purchases a small fishing shack that's there. This photograph here has several fishing shacks used by different fishermen. And over the years, as Dalí started to earn a little more money and a little more money, he and Gala would purchase the adjacent fishing shack and start to expand the house. And that's why if you go to visit the museum, his house is now a museum, it's very intricate and it's labyrinthian, and that's because these were all small houses that were attached after the fact. So it's absolutely extraordinary. It's very much the mind of Dalí, but it also shows you a determination. You know, Dalí and his father had this terrible fight. He doesn't just go to Paris and remain there. He goes to the little cove right next to his father's favorite house and builds his own, establishes his own estate. This became a place for Dalí and Gala to entertain many of their friends. I love this photograph. This is Gala truly enjoying herself, and she's here with René Crevel, who was a very close friend of theirs. René Crevel was a surrealist poet and writer. He was a communist and he was homosexual. And that combination became very difficult for him within the surrealist group. He was very, very close with Dalí and Gala, enjoyed their company immensely, but he was a very troubled individual. And André Breton, the leader of surrealism, had no ability to have homosexuals within the group. He was very homophobic. And as a result, it became a really complicated and difficult problem for René Crevel. And then later, surrealism and the French Communist Party had this rupture, which made things even worse for him, and eventually he takes his life. So this is 1931. By 1934, he had taken his life. But for a period of time, he visited often here in Port Legat, and there's a number of photographs of that. Another an unusual photographic grouping. This is 1935, another group of surrealists coming to visit, and this time it's Gala's former husband, Paul Eluard, with his new wife, Noosh Eluard, and another surrealist poet, René Char, and Dalí's the one who took this photograph. So there's a couple photographs out there by Dalí, not many, but he definitely was fascinated by cameras. So again, the beach is your place for entertaining. By the 1930s, as Dalí becomes a surrealist, the beach becomes a place to find apparitions. And I'm going to show you just a variety of paintings that reinforce this. Of course, the persistence of memory, the best-known painting of all of surrealism, inspired by one of these rocks on the coast, just a little bit further north from Port Legat, a place named Cap de Creus. And you can see that the face of Dalí, which becomes a self-portrait, which is seemingly washed up here on the beach, is inspired by the same shape here of this particular rock. And so this idea that the beach is a setting for these kind of visions is reinforced over and over again. Shades of Night Descending, Dalí has essentially placed the rocks from Cap de Creus onto the beach of Roses, which is a little further south in the same region, but it's like he's emptied the water out. So here it's just sand and jagged rocks with, of course, a very, very curious and very terrifying figure that just seems to be starting to emerge from behind the rocks. So a sinister landscape filled with foreboding, and yet at the same time, absolutely extraordinary. And then there's this piece. This is if you've never seen it in person, it's only about 3 to 4 inches tall. It's absolutely stunning. It's a miniature by Dalí called The Specter of Sex Appeal. And we have the image that we're familiar with, the young Dalí in a sailor suit holding the hoop and bone. And he's standing here in front of this incredibly horrifying, ghastly specter, this creature that's created by bags and rocks and flesh, all kind of rotting at the same time. And it's as if he's becoming aroused by the vision. So the vision of the grotesque, the vision of the horror is arousing in the way he's presented this. So it's a very unusual vision. It's perhaps a very disturbing vision, but it's a vision, again, captured on the beaches there right outside of his home in Port Legat. And then something a little more, I won't say pleasant, but I will say more subtle, is the Weaning of Furniture Nutrition, where Dalí has basically created an exact replica, almost a photographic replica of the beach right in front of his house, but he's added a person who doesn't belong. What he would normally see if he looked out in the middle of the day is that there would be women, the wives of fishermen, mending nets while their husbands are out at sea fishing. Dalí has a memory of his nanny, the woman who raised him as a child, and in the same way that she weaned him away from his mother, he's taken her memory and weaned it from the past into the present. And she now is sitting here as if she's mending a fishing net. So he's taken a memory and he's placed her in the present. And then out of her body, he's taken this chest of drawers and this small bit of medicine that he associated with her. And he weans that or pulls that out of her body like a jigsaw puzzle piece. But this incredible vision is taking place in this exact replica, this absolutely gorgeous replica of the beach that you would see even today if you walked outside of Dalí's house. It looks exactly like this. And then as the 1930s get a little bit further, the beach becomes a place for total hallucinations. And I say that because unlike these type of paintings, which are very symbolic and seem to be far more sinister, this is much, much more subtle. This is called White Calm. It's a bay of water, very much like what he's looking out at every day from the studio. And there's a couple figures. And as you start to look at it, you realize things are not right. Doesn't quite add up. This guy is over here looking very much like a scarecrow holding a pitchfork, just standing on a rock in the middle of the bay. We have this beautiful woman standing here, but then her relationship and distance from this person doesn't seem right. It's like as if it's become foreshortened. The distance he should be from her doesn't seem to add up. And then over here we have a group of figures in a boat. There is no horizon. There's just a suggestion by this over here. And there's a little amphora that's been placed here. It's broken. You can't quite see it in the slide, but it all becomes a bit out of focus. It becomes a bit wrong, and it becomes a subtle way of suggesting something much more sinister, like you are starting to see apparitions that are not there. And Dalí does a number of paintings in 1936 around this kind of theme. Here's another one of these. This one's called Paranoid Astral Image. There's that same amphora. And we have some interesting figures that all seem to make sense until you start to try to figure out why they would all be there. So we have a gentleman over here walking, seemingly unconcerned about anything. And he has a scarf that's flying into the air as if there's a lot of wind, but that wind seems to be isolated just to him. In the background, there's a woman who just seems to drift across the space. And what we know about this woman, Dalí used her many times, it's his dead cousin, Carolinetta, who becomes like a ghost who is present in these images. And then we have a child and a woman placed in a boat that seems to be stranded as if there's no water going to be coming for another couple hours. And you just realize as you start to try to figure out how they all relate to each other, they don't. They're all as if they've been collaged together in the same space. So again, it's very subtle, it's very beautiful, and yet it becomes much more haunting, like we're seeing ghosts or spirits in the landscape. And then something a little more fantastic from 2 years later, but up in our collection, we have the Enchanted Beach with the three fluid graces, which is maybe the best image to think about with Dalí and the beach, because here we have three figures from mythology associated with the beach and with the water. And what we often share with our visitors is that even though Dalí calls them the three graces, these are the three fates, the ones who will weave the thread of life for us, will measure that thread of life, and eventually will cut that thread of life once our fate has come to its end. And so they're really compelling, they're very strange, they have these very clinging outfits, and they often have double images for their faces. This one's face is here, but also becomes a skull. If you can see these two as eye sockets and the teeth inside of the skull. But what's also interesting is that their clothing corresponds to the waves behind them. So they're very much natural apparitions of the nature rather than something that you would encounter. And then the last thing from the 1930s, really fun but very strange, is that Dalí gets an opportunity to build a pavilion at the World's Fair in New York City. And what he decides to do is create a mermaid show where we are talking about the Venus herself, the Venus de Milo, and the secret of her imagination as she dreams. So what you're essentially doing is you're walking into this pavilion, which recreates the dream of the sleeping Venus who you encounter on a bed, and then you essentially see a mermaid show of her visions with a number of topless mermaids. So it's quite extraordinary, quite strange, and again, it's all aquatic and beach related. So for Dalí, the most sublime and strange visions are associated with water and the beach. And then this is a nice little detail that I'm sure everybody here is familiar with, our double image painting of the disappearing bust of Voltaire. What you may not have noticed is that the fruit dish over here actually becomes another beach scene. So this is the detail. You can see the guitar here seems to transform into a boat. There's a rock and a figure standing next to the water. So the pair becomes part of the mountain behind it. So lots and lots of reinforcing of the idea of the water and the desire to enjoy what it provides. So in the 1940s, of course, the Nazis invade France. Dalí and Gala have to flee. So when not in Spain, when not able to go to southern France, where do you go? Well, one of the things Dalí made sure is that he went to Carmel in California and went to Pebble Beach. And this is a photograph of Salvador Dalí and his wife Gala at one of those classic overlooks in Pebble Beach with the Monterey cypress trees in Del Monte. So he spent quite a bit of time here, occasionally over several years. And this was during the time he was working with Walt Disney. So that's, this actually, 1941 is not when he's working with Disney, it's when he arrives, and it's when he holds the incredible sort of banquet in the Enchanted Forest as a fundraiser, and they bring all the animals there. 5 years later, Dalí is still staying at Del Monte Lodge, and that's when he works with Walt Disney. One of the things that comes out of Dalí's imagination while he's working there, 1942, is this image based on a poster by Montague Dawson. And the original poster was just a boat, a ship, like a nautical vessel with these grand sails. It was very, very popular as a print amongst people who were enthusiasts of the water and people at yacht clubs and things like that. Dalí takes that poster and he adds a few subtle changes, creating this remarkably strange mythological figure like a gorgon that seems to emerge out of the water, lassoed to all of these sails in very precarious ways, lots of references to bondage. It's this fantastic and frightening vision of a monstrous sea creature lassoed into all of these sails. And so at the end of the 40s, Dalí returns to Port Legat. He starts developing the house that we know today, Dalí's villa in Port Legat. You can see this is a view from the house looking out into the water, into the Bay of Port Legat, and that's Safranera, the island at the tip of it. And Dalí's garden area had this little opening, so he could look out at any point and quickly spy on people who were enjoying the beach outside of his house. This is the view that he would have. This is the beach currently, so it's constantly in use, constantly still being enjoyed by the fishermen. Dalí planted a cypress tree into a boat right in front of his house, which now has become this massive cypress, which has landlocked the boat. So this kind of this mysterious juxtaposition of a living tree and something that's supposed to allow us to go out into the bay. And then Dalí also creates this extraordinary pool, which is his phallus pool. Not sure if you can quite see that, but it seems pretty obvious in some respects. It's absolutely a gorgeous place where Dalí would often entertain many, many people. So this was the place where Dalí would hold gatherings, and he would often do a lot of business when he would invite people over. But it was just beautiful. And Walt Disney, in I believe the 1950s, he and his wife come to visit Dalí and Gala in Port Legat. So again, lots of ways of reaffirming these connections that Dalí makes and uses the beach as a place to entertain. So in the 1950s, the beach becomes a site for something different, not so much apparitions as cosmic visions that are more mystical rather than Freudian. And we begin with something like Christ of St. John of the Cross, where this basically 20th century crucifixion, post-atomic crucifixion, is presented right over the beach outside of Dalí's house. So it's both universal and very personal for him and very local. Great photograph by Clyde Butcher here on the right-hand side, and you can see it's the same sort of a magic that he's trying to create in his own paintings, capturing this atmospheric wonderland that is presented right outside of his door here in the Bay of Port Legat. Here we have a reference to the fish from the sea and also the bread from the land brought together in a reference to the feeding of the multitudes. So the nature more evangelique becomes more of a ritualistic sort of Spanish Baroque presentation of 2 loaves of Spanish bread and then 2 regular fish and this flounder in the middle of it. And then, of course, when Dalí returns to the disintegration of returns to the persistence of memory in 1954, he situates the painting as more of an apocalyptic vision, the disintegration of the world as he knows it. And of course, it's the world of Port Legat, the Bay of Port Legat, dissolving, floating, transforming into atomic particles as it's dissolved in the light of the atomic bomb. So he's constantly thinking about the beach as his own stand-in representative. And the Nature More Vivant, this painting that has to do with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The water is very much a kind of Botticelli water that Dalí shows coming right into his studio as it starts to break up into water particles or paint particles. So there's this kind of magical transformation from the Renaissance into the present where things start to float and become dislodged from one another. But again, it's Dalí's studio just looking out of his balcony. Dalí has a great quote here. He says, "Like a good worker, I covet simple things, eating grilled sardines and strolling with Gala along the beach at sunset and seeing how the Gothic rocks are transformed into the nightmares by the darkness." Isn't that what we all enjoy doing as we go to the beach? There might be something a little bit different about Dalí's understanding of his beach, but nevertheless, it was a source of great inspiration and enjoyment. And now I've just got a collection of some really fun photos of Dalí enjoying the beach and totally identifying as a beachgoer kind of individual. So here's one from 1953, Dalí in his robe by his boat, standing on the dock outside of his house. Also, he has jasmine flower behind his ear, his favorite scent. Here's an image of Gala posing for Dalí, topless, looking out onto the same port, and Dalí has gathered some of the things that wash up on the beach around her, so that there's something very fascinating about whatever it is we're looking at here. This is Dalí having fun with nautilus shells and and starfish. So he's wearing some sort of peculiar piece of jewelry, but he has the two sides of the nautilus shell, which fascinated him because they were logarithmic spirals, which is part of what he references in Nature More Vivant. And then he has sort of the halo of the starfish behind him. Here's Dalí a little more haute couture, enjoying himself, adorned with rocks and seashells along the beach. Here he's adorned with seaweed. So Dalí not only has a mustache, but he also now has a beard and an extra bit of hair from the seaweed. A few years later, here's Dalí wearing a crown, bathing with Gala, who still has her sunglasses on, in Culp Cove. Here's Dalí and Gala once again enjoying the food from the sea. They're eating sea urchins. And apparently there's a reference that Dalí has in Secret Life saying, you eat the ones with the red cross, not the yellow cross. They're the ones that are not ready to be eaten yet. Dalí having some fun. I don't know what this photograph's about, but I find it very provocative. He's sitting on something he calls the salon of the throne, which is simply an amazing piece of wood that has been created into a seat. Gala's behind him. He's holding leprechaunish kind of gnome-like figure, and then this the cube. Here's very lovely, a rare photograph to see of Dalí and Gala being very tender with one another in 1959 on the boat in front of their house. Another photograph of them enjoying the sea, traveling out, where they also entertain. And then I don't know where Dalí got this. I assume it's a rubber dolphin, but nevertheless, we often see Dalí painting figures with bread on their head or rocks on their head. Here we have Dalí with a dolphin on his head, 1959. Dalí painting, enjoying the rocks of Cap de Creus, relaxing, but at the same time using it as a creative opportunity. And then Dalí and Gala submerging the lace maker by Vermeer into the Mediterranean for testing purposes. I'm not quite sure what, but nevertheless, he makes sure he also has his red Baratina on, looking very stylish. And then this is a book that we have for sale in our store. It's called Swimming with Dalí, and it's written by Edward Mullins, who is, I believe, an art critic for an English paper, and he did a number of visits with artists along the water. But he says that, in particular, related to Dalí, I ended up spending a few days with Dalí, which included, at his invitation, a swim in the sea pool right by his house on the Costa Brava. I have this vivid memory of swimming and listening to Dalí with his head above the water, talking about his life, and with his mustache almost like a periscope. It was absolutely fascinating to enjoy his company. You know, and I think that's really it. It's like Dalí felt the most comfortable, the most relaxed, and the most open when he was at the sea, when he was enjoying the Mediterranean, or when he was entertaining by his pool. These were the places where he had total control because they were him and he was the landscape. And so this is the book just called Swimming with Dalí. And then finally, the beach is a site of self-discovery. So this is a really peculiar painting that I don't show often enough, but I think is very appropriate here. This is a painting from 1950 where the title of it is Dalí at the age of 6, when he thought he was a girl, lifting the skin of the water to see if the dog is sleeping in the shade of the sea. It's extraordinary, it's very strange, and it is totally fascinating. So this is a Dalí self-portrait as a little girl. And the dog is sleeping very much like it does at the bottom of the Curator painting in our collection. Here we have The Discovery of America by Christopher Columbus. We don't know if this is exactly the bay outside of Dalí's house. It probably is, but we do know that this curious celestial shape at the bottom is a sea urchin, which would have come from the beach right in front of Dalí's house. And the particular kind of sea urchin is what do you call it? It's almost there. Sputnik is the name of the sea urchin. Been long known as that, but this was just 1 year after Sputnik was launched by the Russians. And so this painting, which is about about discovery, discovering new worlds, there's a reference to space travel using a sea urchin right outside of the beach from his house. And then the last painting, of course, is the hallucinogenic Toreador, where there's this extraordinary sort of celebration of Dalí and Spanish culture and Catalan culture. And he has the Venus de Milo here, many Venus de Milos, transforming into the face of a bullfighter. And in particular, one of the interpretations that I think is really spot on, there's 31 Venuses in this painting. And the reason for that seems to be that Dalí is placing himself in the mind of a fly. You can see there's all these flies that are transforming throughout the painting. And flies, of course, have multifaceted eyes. And what you're seeing is the same Venus from multiple perspectives simultaneously, just like a fly would see it. So it's kind of an extraordinary way of thinking about things. Dalí always talked about the flies that were along the beach in the Catalan region. They were called gadflies. They're like horse flies. They bite, they're brutal, they are unpleasant, but they are very much a part of the beach as much as anything else that we've seen. And so this painting becomes this sort of hallucinogenic transformation of the experience of these horse flies, gadflies, into a kind of visionary experience. And you can see that Dalí has once again placed us on the cove. Here's the cove of Cap de Creus, with the rocks becoming the bull right above it, and then the reflection of that particular dog that we saw a moment ago, which now has become simply spots on a Dalmatian's back. So with that, with the summer upon us, let's not forget to use some sunscreen when we go out there. And remember to celebrate Dalí as we think about Dalí at the beach. Thank you all for coming today. Hope you have a great day. Thank you. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yes?
So, tremendous value added there, lots to unpack in your presentation, and the way you integrated the beach into all of the art that you showed. Can I ask a simple question about Dalí's art, and whether or not the medium is the message, in the sense that what Dalí painted was a narrative to disrupt normal perspectives of life, not necessarily a reflection of who he is personally. If you get the distinction there.
Okay.
To what extent would that have value as you see Dalí?
So the question is, Dalí uses the opportunity to paint to create visions, to create something that's a rather extraordinary understanding of reality, almost throughout his entire career. And disruptive, right. Disrupt our experience of reality as something that's familiar, makes it strange, makes it different. And the question is, does that reflect Dalí's self, or is this Dalí painting objectively where his self is somewhere else, I suppose?
Well, the question really is framed a little more biased, and does it not reflect Dalí? In other words, is it not part of his intention to be reflective of a message of any kind, except the message is disruption of perception by the viewer.
I think you could probably expand that a little bit, and you could say that while Dalí's goal is ultimately to undermine all of us and to surprise us, I think he not only values but desires to create a sense of chaos in his own world that can be sustained. And I don't think it's sustainable. I think that's often what these photographs of him show, is that Dalí was very much like ourselves, a person who enjoyed some of the simple pleasures of life. But when he had the opportunity to create and share with us a vision, he was trying to provoke himself as well as ourselves to force us to look at things that may be unpleasant, or to force us to think about things at a very different angle. But I do think that he himself desired that experience as much as he wanted to provoke us to experience it that way. You know, I think that he wanted to sustain an Alice in Wonderland world, which just wasn't sustainable, you know, and so that's why we have this constant slippage back into normalcy and pleasantries. But yeah, that's a very, very good way of thinking about this. Any other questions related to the beach or otherwise? Well, if not, thank you all for coming today. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon.